this webinar. I appreciate your patience, and I'd like to, first of all, thank you all for taking the time. This is a slightly different sort of subject, and as we get deeper and deeper into it, I think you'll understand more why we're involved in it. So the topic of tonight's webinar is U.S. Executive Order 11415, and the sanctions against Israelis that have resulted from this American executive order, not only U.S. sanctions, but also following after the lead of the American government, sanctions that have been imposed on Israeli citizens and organizations by a host of other countries and by the European Union itself. So I'm going to share my screen and show you some slides, if I can. Hold on. This is not going well. Hold on a minute. Bear with me. We've had some challenges today. Hold on a minute. I need to pull up another document. There it is. Coming? Maybe? Sorry? Yes. Okay. Now I can share my screen. And you should be seeing some slides. So what we'd like to talk about this evening is the executive order itself, what it is, what it says, what it means to do.
We don't see the slides. Can you try to pull it up again?
Hold on. How about that?
Yes.
Okay. We win. All right. So Executive Order 14115 was issued on the 1st of February 2024, and we have seen as a result of that executive order quite a lot of activity on the international in the international arena that has impacted Israeli individuals and organizations, and I dare say the Israeli government itself. So we're going to have a look at what the executive order actually says, what it doesn't say, what's unusual about it, what the impacts have been. And then we're going to talk briefly about what Regavim is, what our involvement is, why we're there, why we're involved in this issue at all, and possibly what the future holds, although no one really knows. So, Executive Order 14115. The title, the subtitle of it is Imposing Certain Sanctions on Persons Undermining Peace, Security, and Stability in the West Bank. So the point of the executive order was to preserve the peace in the West Bank. Now, preserve the peace, you may say, or may not say, but should say, is a kind of a far-reaching thing, since there is very little peace to be preserved at the moment. But we're going to talk about more in depth what the executive order, where it comes from and where it's going. So this is the opening paragraph of the executive order itself. And the question is, by what authority the United States of America is getting involved in activities of Israeli citizens who are in Israel, not in the United States, and not impacting the United States. So the executive order begins as follows: by the authority vested in me as president by the Constitution of the United States of America, et cetera, lists a whole lot of laws that empower the president of the United States to take certain extra legislative steps, things that are outside of the normal parameters of legislation, of creating law, of punishing people under the law, etc. The most important of these is the National Emergency Act. And we're going to see why that is the case. The rationale behind the imposition of these sanctions begins in the very next paragraph. I, Joseph R. Biden Jr., and we're going to read this together carefully and slowly because this is the crux of the issue. I, Joseph R. Biden Jr., President of the United States. Sorry, I just want to collapse this out of my way, and that's not working. Okay. That's not working. Sorry. I want to be sharing my screen again. I want to share my screen.
Your screen is
we're
shared.
Go back. Okay, because I'm not seeing it. All right. I'm not seeing my screen, but here we are. Okay. I, Joseph R. Biden Jr., President of the United States, find that the situation in the West Bank, in particular, sorry, this is really annoying me. I can't see all the words. There we go. In particular, high levels of extremist settler violence, forced displacement of people and villages, and property destruction has reached intolerable levels and constitutes a serious threat to the peace, security, and stability of the West Bank and Gaza, Israel, and the broader Middle East region. Now, that alone is not enough to justify the enactment of the US's emergency powers, the presidential emergency powers. So it goes on. These actions undermine the foreign policy objectives of the United States, including the viability of a two-state solution and ensuring Israelis and Palestinians can attain equal measures of security, prosperity, and freedom. Now, before we go any further, I want to point out, again, stress that there has to be a rationale that justifies the president taking this extra legal step. And that step, that justification, that rationale has to involve a core US interest. And in this case, for the first time in history, the interest that is being cited here is US foreign policy. Okay, so we're going to go on from there. They also undermine the security of Israel and have the potential to lead to broader regional destabilization across the Middle East. And here's the underlined part, threatening United States personnel and interests. So in other words, the violence that the executive order intends to curtail, that it targets with these sanctions, has been deemed as a threat to the United States personnel and to the United States interests, and specifically foreign policy objectives. For these reasons, these actions constitute an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States. I hereby declare a national emergency to deal with that threat. Again, let me stress, the national emergency is not an emergency in the state of Israel, and it's not an emergency in the West Bank. It is a US national emergency, because this threat has been deemed to be one that threatens the United States at a level that is that justifiably rationalizes the imposition of sanctions against foreign nationals. Okay, so we can talk about the unusual nature of these sanctions, first of all, in terms of, for the first time ever, targeting a policy or protecting a US foreign policy. But that wouldn't have been enough if the presidential order had not justified the imposition of sanctions by declaring a state of emergency in the United States of America because US personnel and interests are under threat from this, quote unquote, extremist settler violence. So anyone who wants to know more about the extremist settler violence that is being discussed here and that has been the basis of all this need go no further than to look at our previous website, at our previous webinar on the issue of settler violence, or to reference some of the lectures I've given in recent months about the issue of settler violence, where this entire narrative comes from, who's producing it, and to what effect. But understand, please understand, that the entire narrative of settler violence has been in preparation since 2019 and has been waiting for actual application, practical application in the real world, rather than just the general background demonization and delegitimization of Jewish presence in Judea and Samaria. The narrative of settler violence has now reached full bloom in that it is the basis for a state of national emergency in the United States, claiming that extremist, violent Jewish settlers are threatening US interests and US security and US personnel. Now, another thing that we need to point out here, and notice that I brought this entire wording, and the next slide will have even more of the wording of the executive order, but I'd like you to notice that so far, it has not mentioned Jews, nor has it mentioned Arabs, nor has it mentioned terrorism. It has talked exclusively, but not exclusively, but has mentioned in particular extremist settler violence. Okay, so here's the next slide. Who's in the crosshairs? So the executive order goes on to enumerate who can and will be sanctioned under the executive order. Any foreign person determined to be responsible for or complicit in, or to have directly or indirectly engaged or attempted to engage in any of the following. Now, follow along with me carefully here. Any foreign person, meaning not a US citizen, who has engaged in the following actions, including directing, enacting, implementing, enforcing, or failing to enforce policies that threaten the peace, security, or stability of the West Bank. Again, this is a policy issue, which this very first paragraph here opens the door for sanctioning any member of the Israeli government, any member of the Israeli police force, any member of the Israeli army, or those entire bodies as a whole, because they have either enforced or failed to enforce policies that the United States of America deems to be destabilizing. 2, any person or entity planning, ordering, otherwise directing, or participating in any of the following actions affecting the West Bank. 1, an act of violence or threat of violence targeting civilians. 2, efforts to place civilians in reasonable fear of violence with the purpose or effect of necessitating a change of residence to avoid such violence. 3, property destruction. Or 4, seizure and dispossession of property by private actors. So, I don't know how many of you are up on the news, but you may not have heard that there are people who carry out acts of violence that target civilians in the West Bank and place them in reasonable fear of violence and destroy their property. And those people aren't necessarily Jews. You may not have heard this, but the Jewish residents of Judea and Samaria, i.e. the West Bank, are overwhelmingly the victim of activities of that sort. And it's not Jews who are carrying them out. Keep that in mind for a moment as we carry on. So what I'm trying to say is that if these are the clauses of the executive order, what we should expect to see in the next slide is a long list of Arab terrorists who have either been apprehended or not, or who are Arab terrorists who are at large, or heads of terrorist groups, or those who support terrorism and call for the eradication of the state of Israel or the death of Jews. We would expect to see a long list of those names on the list of sanctioned individuals and organizations. So hold your breath if you like, but we're not going to see that. The next paragraph says, any foreign person determined to be planning, ordering, otherwise directing, or participating in any of the following actions: an act of violence, efforts to place civilians in reasonable fear of violence, property destruction, or seizure or dispossession of private property. So in other words, anyone who's taking part in any of these planning actions on an organizational level or on an individual level can be sanctioned. All fine. Very promising support from our democratic ally to help Jews survive the onslaught of terrorism, right? Well, let's look at who's actually been sanctioned under Executive Order 11415. In the first round, there were 3 Israeli individuals, Einan Tangil, Shalom Zicherman, and Yinon Levy. All 3 of them were sanctioned by the United States government. Now, you've probably never heard of any of them, and I have some news for you. The Israel police and the IDF and the civil administration and the courts of Israel have never heard of them either. None of these people have been tried even charged with a crime of any kind. Another organization that was sanctioned at the same time in order to balance things out, I'm actually not clear that it was the first round, it may have been the second round, was the Lion's Den, an extremely violent PFLP affiliated terrorist group operating out of Jenin. The problem is this: you sanction a terror group that has no known leadership or structure, no bank accounts, no address, and is not an actually existing entity. It is simply terrorists who declare themselves part of the Lion's Den. So in other words, this was declarative only and did not actually impact a single human being on planet Earth. The next round of sanctions included both individuals, which I've capitalized, and entities. Tzvi Bar Yosef of Tzvi's farm, Moshe Sharvit, Moshe's farm, and Neria Ben Pazi, also a farmer in Judea and Samaria, but his particular establishment was not actually sanctioned. So please note what all the people in that round have in common. They are all farmers. Round 3, Ben-Zion Gopstein, who you may have heard of. He heads an organization called Lahava, but Lahava was not actually sanctioned. 2 organizations called the Mount Hebron Fund and Shlom Asiraich. I've put those in a different color because there is a difference about those sanctions, which I'll get to in a moment. Mrs. Daniela Weiss, who heads the Nahala movement and promotes that supports the creation of new Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria, and Noam Fetterman, who holds political views that are not consonant with U.S. foreign policy. Now, the Mount Hebron Fund and Shlom Asiraich are interesting because they were sanctioned as secondary sanctions, meaning they attempted to assist people who had been sanctioned in round 2. Tzvi Bar Yosef, Moshe Sharvit. These are organizations that tried to collect funds to help the people who had been sanctioned get legal representation so that they could extricate themselves or defend their good name. And therefore, these were secondary sanctions, and they were sanctioned as well. The next round was very interesting, particularly to us at Regavim. Tzav 9, as you see on the screen, was sanctioned for peaceful legal activity, which was actually taken over by more violent activist groups who took credit for destroying some of the humanitarian supplies. But Tzav Teisha was a nonviolent civil protest movement, some 15,000 people strong, and Tzav Teisha itself and one of the organizers of the movement, a mother of 8 from Netivot called Reut Ben Chaim, were sanctioned in the 4th round in the 4th tranche, they call it, for what was claimed to have been violence, what was actually protected free speech, and certainly not violent. And the 5th round really tipped the hand and actually revealed the cards behind all of these sanctions. The 5th round sanctioned someone named Elor Azaria. Elor Azaria, for those of you who follow the news, is a young man who was a medic in the army and was charged with shooting a bound terrorist who had been captured. He claimed that he was afraid that the terrorist was wearing an explosive vest and had made a sudden move, and therefore he shot him. Be that as it may, whether or not he was justified or not, he was arrested, he was tried, he was found guilty, and he served time in an Israeli jail. And this, by the way, the crime for which Elor Azaria is being sanctioned was committed 8 years ago. So why does this round of sanctions really show the US government's cards? Because they could not, under US law, impose economic sanctions against Elor Azaria. His crime had been committed too long ago, and there is no double jeopardy. So what they did was they imposed only part of the sanctions against him, meaning he and his family are now barred from entering the United States. Not that he was planning on going to the United States, but that is the state. Now, all of these things are unique. All of these actions are unprecedented. And I'd like to talk about what makes them different than all other sanctions. The tool of sanctions is not unheard of, but the use of sanctions in this way is completely new. So we're going to talk about that in a minute. But before we do, I want to talk about who hasn't been sanctioned yet, but may be. I wouldn't say it was leaked. I would say it was announced by the State Department itself that they were considering, and may still be considering, imposing sanctions on whole units of the IDF in a time of war. Also, an entire unit, the Israel Border Police, Magav, and on ministers in the government of Israel. Now, between you and me, it is clear that the point of the sanction, it's an inverse pyramid, because the people at the bottom of this list of who might yet be sanctioned are really the people that they're trying to get to. That is the goal of the sanctions, to sanction Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, key members of the current government coalition, means to topple the Netanyahu government and force elections in the state of Israel so that they, the people behind all of this, can engineer a change of regime in the state of Israel that will be more consonant with American foreign policy. I'm not going to call this by its name, but I think everyone who's with us here today knows exactly what this means and what it is. We're going to look a little further. Before we talk about the unique characteristics of the sanctions, let's look at who has not been sanctioned yet and won't be sanctioned. Not a single Nukhba terrorist whose names are known, whose identities are known, who are sitting in detention awaiting trial, not one of them has been named as a sanctioned non-American citizen. Not one of the terrorists who works for the Palestinian Authority, whose names are publicized in Palestinian Authority literature, posters, media posts, etc. Not one of them has ever been sanctioned. Not the leaders of the Palestinian Authority who continue to publicly and officially encourage and support terrorism and pay terrorists. Not even the Ayatollah Khamenei. The leadership of UNRWA that has been found to aid and abet Hamas, individual employees of UNRWA who have been proven to have participated in massacres and in hostage holding have been sanctioned. The international anarchists who are running around the countryside in Judea and Samaria inciting violence, some of them have been actually deported from Israel and others are still at large. Not one of them whose names, identities, social security numbers, and home addresses are all well known have ever been sanctioned. And again, not the leadership of or diplomatic corps of countries that have violated international law and recognized the state of Palestine. Just to give you an idea of some of the people who should be on the list for sanction and are not and never will be. So what makes all of this, what makes these sanctions so unique? As I said, the tool of sanctions is not new. The US government has used sanctions in the past. It has used sanctions against allied countries in the past. It has imposed sanctions against democracies in the past. It has also sanctioned individuals who are non-US citizens and their surrounding and their family, who are their support system. So what makes these sanctions different? For the first time, the US government, the Biden administration, created a separate committee, essentially, a branch to find people to sanction, to identify people that they wanted to sanction. That has never happened before. Any other time sanctions have been imposed against a foreign government or actors in that government has always been for a specific action. If, for example, a foreign government entered into an arms deal that violated other arms agreements or treaties with the United States imposed sanctions until those third-party deals were either canceled or mediated to the United States government's satisfaction. Any other time individuals have been sanctioned, they have been drug dealers, they have been heads of international cartels, they have been major crime syndicate figures, international crime syndicate figures, that sort of thing. So the mother of 8 from Netivot is now on the same list, for example, as Yahya Sinwar. Yahya Sinwar being one of the few people who has been actually sanctioned, but she's apparently way above the danger levels of the Ayatollah Khamenei. So there are many things that are strange and unusual about all of this. Another thing that needs to be considered is why the sanctions were imposed when they were. The timing is very, very interesting. Let's put it that way. The state of Israel is under attack on numerous fronts. We are reeling from the worst day in modern Israeli history, modern Jewish history. Anti-Semitism is off the charts, as is anti-Jewish violence, all through Judea and Samaria, and the data is available in previous webinars. But again, the timing is very, very, very telling. Apparently, and this is not my supposition, this is the analysis of one of the leading analysts, US foreign policy analysts, Michael Doran, who wrote a telling article in Tablet magazine. If you don't read it, I will summarize it for you. He said, right after October 7th, the US government was afraid that there would be a right-wing shift among the Israeli public. And in order to balance that out, they needed to act to target right-wing activists, politicians, and ideas, the entire policy of the right wing of Israel, in order not to let that swing to the right that they anticipated in the aftermath of October 7th to actually take root among the Israeli public. That's a very interesting analysis of the timing, and it's one that I find tremendously convincing. The fact that Kamala Harris has now appointed the person who was most instrumental in targeting Israelis for sanctions, as a major member of her team, speaks for itself. The person who has selected the Israeli citizens who will be sanctioned will be given more or less free rein to control the conversation with the Jewish community and the Jewish world. That is a very, very telling statement. Aside from everything else, current and former members of the Biden administration have spoken plainly, including Tom Nides, have spoken plainly about the need to replace the Netanyahu government, and these sanctions are part and parcel of that. So that begins to explain why and how Regavim has gotten involved with this issue. Again, we are a land use, land policy based organization. We also advocate for the rights for Jews to settle and develop Judea and Samaria, and we advocate for full Israeli sovereignty over Judea and Samaria. But that's a little bit of a step away from getting involved in this issue of sanctions. So here's a few points that that brought us to get involved. The first thing is that there's a ricochet effect of the sanctions on our judiciary and our legislature, and that is part and parcel, really, possibly even the most terrifying part of this entire new sanctions regime. By saying that anyone who works against the U.S. vision for a two-state solution can be sanctioned, essentially the United States government has dictated to Israel's judiciary and legislature what they can and cannot find in their decisions. So when the talk started about there was talk, and there still is talk, about sanctioning Regavim, the claim was that our crime was and is going to court to petitioning the courts and bringing about the demolition of illegal structures, particularly an illegally built school that was funded by the European Union. So by saying that, and that school was demolished, and that doesn't sit well with our foreign allies. So the interesting thing is, if you say that we can be sanctioned for petitioning the courts to have that school demolished, what does that say about the court itself that found that those structures should be demolished? And what does it say about the Israeli Defense Forces, the army that actually did demolish those structures? All of those can now be sanctioned in a domino effect. So we understood the danger behind all of this. The next step is really understanding that this is not just our fight. It's not a right-wing thing, it's not a left-wing thing, it's not a Regavim thing, and it's not about any of the individuals or organizations who were sanctioned. What we're talking about here is the bedrock of democracy and the protection of speech and dissent that the United States government guarantees to its own citizens, that the government of Israel guarantees to its citizens, and that no one is protected. So we decided that we had to take serious action in order to highlight the outrageous violation of protected speech and of the freedom to hold opinions and to view policy in a way that may not sit well with the Biden administration. So what you see on the right side of the screen is the front page of a petition. We went to court. We are suing. We and some others are suing the Department of Treasury, the Secretary of Treasury, the Department of Homeland Security. Essentially, we're suing the Biden administration for violations of freedom of speech, for violations of freedom of religion, because this involves the ability to support those who envision the Jewish sovereignty over Judea and Samaria. We are suing we are pushing this as we do, and this is what Regavim does. We collect data, we collect information, we analyze it, and then we go to court to force the powers that be, in this case, the US administration, to answer some very serious questions about why they believe that these liberties are theirs to take. What has happened with the imposition of sanctions is essentially the criminalization of ideas. As I pointed out earlier, the people who were overwhelmingly, the people who were sanctioned are people who are farmers. They are farmers in Judea and Samaria. They have not broken any laws. They have never been charged, accused, tried of any crime whatsoever, but they're in the way. And the leftist organizations and the anarchist groups that support the ethnic cleansing of Jews from Judea and Samaria have targeted these people for years, not only trying to bait them and to create conflict and then accuse them when they respond of violence, but in this case, they have essentially criminalized their very presence in Judea and Samaria. That is a very alarming thing for a democratic government to do to citizens of another democracy. We've also criminalized government policy. Recently, the Knesset held a vote, and an overwhelming majority of the Knesset voted against Palestinian statehood. That means that the Biden administration can, at any point, sanction the entire Israeli government and every single or any and every member of Knesset for obstructing or opposing its foreign policy. The American foreign policy is for a Palestinian state to be created in the heart of Israel. And this sanctions regime states clearly that anyone who opposes that policy can be sanctioned. Think about that for a minute. This is colonialism, and it undermines the sovereignty of the state of Israel when the United States government thinks it can dictate to the state of Israel, to its legislature and its judiciary, what it can and cannot believe, what it can and cannot support, what it can and cannot legislate or rule. That is colonialism. And we could not stand by and allow the Israeli government, that is admittedly extremely busy at the moment, but we could not stand by and allow the Israeli government not to respond to this incredible challenge to its sovereignty. So we initiated this lawsuit. There will most likely be another lawsuit filed very shortly. We're putting together another team and another group of plaintiffs. In addition to all of that, there has been direct impact on Regavim. We, not only on Regavim, but our Director General, who is a dual citizen, by the way. And I would point out that there are US citizens who hold dual citizenship who have been directly sanctioned or indirectly sanctioned by the US government. This may be a violation of executive privilege. That remains to be clarified in court. There are different readings on the Emergency Powers Act. Excuse me. So we're going to clarify that when the case comes up for a hearing. But Regavim has been impacted by these sanctions. Many of the donation platforms that we have used for fear of being sanctioned, if we are sanctioned, which we have not been, but for fear of being sanctioned, have suspended the ability to transfer donations from abroad in US dollars to Regavim. So we are dealing with that. And we have this cloud hovering above us. People don't want to necessarily step out and speak their mind. And we have found a dampening effect, which is exactly what these sanctions wanted to do, to chill the freedom of Israelis, to cow them into silence. And we could not stand by and let that happen, which is why we filed this petition, this lawsuit against the Biden administration. So I hope that we will have some news to report on that. But that is essentially the long and short of what the sanctions say, what they don't say, who's been sanctioned and why. And we hope that those people, thanks to intensive legal action, media work, and we're working very hard on publicizing all of this abroad, particularly in Europe right now. But every single person who shares the information, who shares our posts on this massive problem, and who shares support, it speaks truth to power, in other words, shares support for and speaks support for Israel's democracy and for Israel's the integrity of Israel's judicial system. All of that will help to ensure that the people who've already been sanctioned will be the last. We cannot afford to lose the relationship that we have with the United States and with Europe. Israel's economy and our future depend on mutual respect between democratic countries and alliances that we have with Western allies. But we need to stand up for ourselves, and the Israeli government will be empowered to do that the more people give them that support. So you, each one of you, is part of that effort. The way to do this, the best way, the easiest way, I think, is to stay informed and stay in touch with us, because we will constantly be putting up updates. We will be putting out calls to action now and then, letter writing campaigns, and share our materials, because the more volume something gets on, more traffic something gets on the internet, the more politicians stand up and take notice. And we are going to be enlisting as many politicians, as many legislators around the world as we can. So you see on your screen here a lot of ways to follow us. The easiest way, if you can't take all of this in at once, is just to go to our website, which is regavim.org. And you can sign up from the website to our newsletter, or just click to follow us either on WhatsApp for updates, on Telegram, on X. It's still listed here as Twitter. Very important to follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram. I think we're even on TikTok, although I try to deny that, but we really are. So all those things are options. And I thank you for your attention. If there are specific questions, I'd be happy to take them now. I think our moderator back in the background might have some.
Yes, there are questions in the chat.
Let's see if I can find them. Hold on, I'm going to stop the screen share. And let's see if I can chat. Yes, chat. Okay, let's see. Is Daniela a U.S. citizen? No. A U.S. citizen who was sanctioned, for example, was not on my list there. Yisachar Man of the Man Farm. Others who are impacted on a secondary level are Yosef Ben Chaim, who is one of the plaintiffs in our case. His wife was sanctioned, and all of their bank accounts have been seized, frozen, all of their business, all of their... now, again, it's very hard to buy things like milk and diapers for 8 children when all of your bank accounts are shut down and no one is allowed to raise money or give you money because they could be sanctioned in a secondary way. So what exactly the Israeli government is doing to help them is another story. Is it possible for us to claim sovereignty over Judea and Samaria? Of course it's possible. Same way that it's possible for us not to, it is possible for us to. I'm afraid the US will not allow Israel to cancel the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords were canceled by the Palestinian Authority in 2009, and we've been making believe ever since that they weren't. In fact, one of Regavim's recent massive successes that we've been working on for many years has just done exactly that, rolled back the Oslo Accords in one section. We have a couple of minutes, so I'll explain to you what I'm talking about, but I encourage you to look on our website to learn more, there was a third round of Oslo agreements. There was Oslo 1 that set up the framework, Oslo 2 that divided up the territory, and Oslo 3 that balanced out the territory held by each side. The state of Israel ceded 13% of the territory to the Palestinian Authority, and 3% of that territory was set aside as a nature reserve under Palestinian Authority jurisdiction. That was called the Y Plantation Agreement, or Y River Plantation Agreement, round 3 of the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords stated specifically that the nature reserve in the Judean desert was a zero construction and development zone. The Palestinian Authority has not only ignored that, it has actually completely shredded that agreement. There is a whole city springing up inside the nature reserve, hundreds and hundreds of illegal structures, but not only that, massive quarrying, massive road clearing, massive paving, water systems provided by the United Nations, the European Union, and others. They're marketing plots of land and handing out free building materials so that people will build inside this no construction zone. This has been going on aside from the massive environmental damage of toxic waste dumping, burning, pollution of all of the streams and all of the tributaries to the Dead Sea from the area. The state of Israel finally, about 2 months ago, announced that it would be reinstating its own enforcement jurisdiction in the Y Plantation. Excuse me. In the Y Plantation Nature Reserve. So, yes, Israel can roll back the Oslo Accords in the face of massive Palestinian Authority violations, and they're everywhere. And the Palestinian Authority itself announced that it would no longer adhere to, honor, or in any way abide by the Oslo Accords, all the way back in 2009 with the declaration of the Fayad Plan. It is in massive violation in that it is not allowed to go to international tribunals or to apply for statehood. Every single thing the Palestinian Authority does and has done for years is a violation of the Oslo Accords and renders them null and void. All Israel has to do is do what it has to do. That's all. It's a question of political will. And at a certain point, like in the Y Plantation Nature Reserve, when our back is pushed up against the wall, Israel will have to do what it has to do. The longer we wait, the worse it gets, but it can be done and it must be done. Next question, what can we do to challenge similar declarations in Canada? So yes, Canada jumped right onto the sanctions bandwagon right after the United States gave the green light. Canada went even further. Canada has now sanctioned the Jewish National Fund, one of the most mainstream, most basic, most veteran pro-Israel organizations, which is not political, which is not violent, which is not anything, and does not operate over the green line. And still, Canada has suspended all donations to the JNF. Speak to your Congress people. I have no ability to understand on what basis they think they can do that. Simply because they don't like the state of Israel and they don't like Jews. Next question, is there a fear that one day all Israel will be sanctioned? Could policy be extended that far? Of course it could be. Sanctioning all Israelis means cutting off diplomatic relations, and there are countries that are threatening to do that, and there probably will be some that will consider it even more seriously. It will be to their detriment. Obviously, there's a lot of reasons why countries maintain diplomatic relations and economic relations and scientific relations and social relations with Israel, and we have to remind them of that all the time. But I think they know that. Okay, let's see, what is Trump's position on these sanctions? He has made no statement. I do not know how to read his mind. Has he committed to annul them? I do not, to the best of my knowledge, he has not made any reference to these sanctions whatsoever. Attorney Mark Zell is one of the team of attorneys that is representing us in the United States. So yes. Do we have specific information which could be distributed to U.S. politicians? Yes, we will be sending out, along with the link to the recording of this webinar, I will send out a link to an information page about the sanctions that I encourage you all to share as widely as you can. And we have lots and lots of posts about it. Anyone who wants more pinpointed, focused information to use with members of Congress or members of your own governments, parliaments, whatever that is. Feel free to contact me directly. My email is in the chat, and it is very simple to remember. It's naomi@regavim.org. Is Jerusalem under the rubric of this EO? It is not a geographic rubric. The EO regards people, and they can be anywhere. The people who were sanctioned don't all live in Judea and Samaria. For example, Rehut ben Chaim, she lives in Netivot, that is sovereign Israel. Other people who live in other places can just as easily be sanctioned. It has nothing to do with your geographic presence. It has to do with you being a destabilizing force. And I have just one parting thought. The Middle East would be extremely stable, although it wouldn't be, if there were no Jews at all. And I think that that's some people's solution to the question of stability and peace in the Middle East. I would just point out that before the State of Israel existed, the Middle East was not the Garden of Eden. And the internal conflicts between the Arab states are legend. So you know very well that there are lots and lots of destabilizing factors that impact Israel, Judea and Samaria, the Middle East as a whole, and the world. And right now, they're all being blamed on the Jews. If that rings a bell, I'm with you. Last question. The PA broke Oslo the day after they were signed by supporting terrorism. They actually broke Oslo, in some cases, before it was even signed, because the Y Plantation Accords, in terms of my apologies, Oslo 1 required the Palestinian Authority to change the charter and to stop incitement, and they never did either of those things. And still, Oslo 2 was created and signed. So before the division of the territory even started, they were in violation, and they continue to be in violation of that agreement to this day. So we have approximately 3 minutes left before our hour is up. Is Bibi supporting your motions to sue? We did not ask for his support to sue. We asked the Israeli government to speak for its citizens. It has not done that to our satisfaction. He was asked to speak when he was in the United States on behalf of sanctioned individuals. We did not ask him to do that. We are not sanctioned individuals or an sanctioned organization. But what we do demand publicly and constantly is for the government of Israel and its prime minister to behave like the government and prime minister of a proud democracy, and to protect the rights of the Jewish people and of every Israeli citizen. I thank you for your time. I'm happy to entertain any other questions or to provide any other materials. Feel free to reach out to me. And I encourage you to look at the website. We have lots and lots of resources there. Until next time, we pray for good news. We pray that more of our hostages are saved and that all of our soldiers come home peacefully, safely, soundly to their families, and that all of the families in Israel who have been displaced by Arab aggression, violence, and attempted murder are able soon to return to their homes and live in peace. Thank you all.